Hi everybody, and welcome to Prenatal Pelvic Floor Strengthening. Today, during day one, we'll be focusing on pelvic floor strengthening education so that we can really understand the role of our pelvic floor and the role that strength plays in pregnancy. So, this is a model of our pelvic floor. As you can see, it's consisted of your lumbar spine, so the low back, your pelvis itself, and some of the muscles down here. So your pelvic floor is considered a sling of muscles in between your pelvis. And these muscles serve lots of really important functions. Particularly in pregnancy, they help support all of the structures above the pelvic floor. So namely your growing belly and your expanding uterus and all of the fluids that come along with pregnancy. And the strength of our pelvic floor at a certain point becomes really important because without the strength, it's impossible for us to support our growing baby. The pelvic floor is consisted of 3 groups of muscles. So we have our rectal muscles, which are our muscles that are posterior or behind in our pelvic floor. So those muscles are kind of more closer to our bum. And those muscles, in order to try and kind of activate them, what you try and think about is squeezing your bum cheeks together. So that's kind of the cue for the back of the pelvic floor. Then we have the middle of our pelvic floor, or kind of the vaginal section of our pelvic floor, which is more the middle of the pelvic floor. In order to recruit those muscles, what we want to think about is kind of drawing a ping pong ball up into our pelvic floor or closing the middle of our pelvic floor, bringing kind of our 2 sits bones together. And then the third group of muscles is called our urethral muscles. They're the muscles that are at the very front of the pelvic floor, closer to the urethra or the clitoris, kind of in the front of it. And to get those muscles on, what we want to think about is drawing the curtains together or kind of closing in on the top of the pelvic floor. Sometimes I almost tell people to think about hooking something up and in from the front of the pelvic floor. And the reason why I kind of have described those three groups of muscles is because a successful Kegel or a pelvic floor contraction should be comprised of squeezing all 3 groups of those muscles. So we're going to practice squeezing them together and squeezing them as a group and then trying to isolate them as well. Some important things to kind of know about strengthening in pregnancy is that strengthening is a very important component of pelvic floor treatment during pregnancy. But at a certain point in pregnancy, it becomes more relevant to transition to doing more lengthening. It's really hard to tell when that switch occurs for most people. The most objective way to understand and gain that information is to go and see a pelvic floor physiotherapist who can internally assess your pelvic floor and tell you when along the journey of pregnancy what is important to you. Sometimes clients will come in with a really tight and restricted pelvic floor because they grip through there a lot. So we want to start by lengthening with them. Some people come in with a very normal feeling pelvic floor, but then they don't have as much strength, so we want to start with strengthening with them. So kind of as a little aside, the best way to objectively know what you should be focusing on in what stage of pregnancy is to just go see a professional who can physically assess the structures that we're talking about. So an important kind of thing to know in terms of pregnancy and throughout pregnancy is, what does not having enough strength in the pelvic floor mean? Well, namely, the symptoms that would come about if you had a lack of strength in the pelvic floor with pregnancy would be something like leaking. So if you're leaking urine when you're jumping, coughing, sneezing, laughing, running, what have you, a loss of that urine control would be a sign that you don't have enough strength. Another thing would be pain. So if you're feeling heaviness or pressure or bogginess, particularly towards the end of a day or maybe after a workout or after a long walk, that would be an indication that your strength in your pelvic floor is being challenged and that pelvic floor is being a little bit overloaded. Another thing could be a feeling of something falling out of the pelvic floor or descending down into the pelvic floor. So sometimes women will say something like, I feel like I have a tampon in, but it's falling out of me, even though I don't have a tampon in. Those kinds of feelings would be the things that would indicate that strengthening would be a pretty important component of pelvic floor treatment for you. But again, seeing a professional to assess those structures would be the best course of action during pregnancy. With all that being said, let's spend the remainder of the time today focusing on recruiting through our pelvic floor. So again, we have the 3 sections of the pelvic floor: our rectal, our vaginal, and our urethral muscles. So again, rectal, vaginal, urethral muscles, and we are going to try and isolate them and then bring them all together for a successful contraction. So I want you to sit up nice and tall on your chair, and now I want you to try and pretend as if you're holding in some gas, or you're squeezing your bum cheeks together. So squeeze those bum cheeks together, hold that. Those are your rectal muscles in your pelvic floor. Good. Now we're going to try and recruit through the middle of the pelvic floor. So now I want you to pretend as if you're picking up that ping pong ball and bringing it in towards the pelvic floor. That is the middle of the pelvic floor. Good job. And now this last one that we're going to try and do is I want you to think about hooking something up and in through the front of the pelvic floor and getting that anterior part of the pelvic floor on. Most women have the most difficult time recruiting the front of the pelvic floor. And so if you're feeling like, oh my goodness, that's a really tricky one and I'm not connected as well, you're in the majority, but keep practicing that, because that's just as important of a recruitment strategy and just as an important muscle group to kind of strengthen as the other 2. So let's try and practice a little bit of that recruitment together, bringing all 3 of those muscle groups together. So we're going to breathe in and out. Good job. And let's do a squeeze, hold, 3, 4, 5, and relax. Good job, everybody. Try and breathe normally throughout the motion, because that's going to help with strengthening through all kind of functional movements in our day-to-day life. We can't hold our breath every time we do a Kegel for the whole time. Good. And relax. Let's do 2 more of these squeezes. And then 1 more. Good. And relax. So a good way to try and kind of isolate the strengthening and try and understand what we're doing in another way is to do something called a pelvic floor raise. So we're going to shift onto the side of our chair so that our one bum cheek is almost off of the chair and the other bum cheek is sitting quite flush. And then we're going to try and bring our pelvic floor up, or our hip up, using just the pelvic floor. So we're thinking about doing this motion. It's a small motion, but you're using your pelvic floor to do it. Good. Let's do 3 more on this side. Again. And last one, you're really recruiting through that right side of the pelvic floor to do this. It looks really easy, but it's actually quite hard to isolate it. And now let's shift to the other side of the chair so that we can practice it on the other side before the end of the day. So lift that guy up, back down. Good. And come up again. Nice work. Let's do 3 more on this side. And again. Good. You shouldn't be gripping through your core. It should be coming from the pelvic floor itself to do that raise. Good job, everybody. Don't worry about if you don't feel like you've mastered recruiting all 3 sections of the pelvic floor at once. It really is a question of practice. It is a question of kind of practice makes perfect. The more time and energy that you invest into trying to recruit and into practicing that Kegel, the more fruitful it will all be. And we're going to spend a lot of time stacking that kind of recruitment cue in with all of the exercises in the upcoming course. So don't worry if you haven't become a master at it yet. We will still do tons of it throughout the course. Thank you, everybody. That brings us to the end of day 1, and we will see you on day 2.